Hello, everybody. This is the Foreign Press Association in New York, and I am Ian Williams, the president. And as part of our ongoing series of podcasts about world affairs and journalists' affairs, I'm talking to Stephen Schlesinger and Craig Mokhiber about President Donald Trump's Board for Peace and his executive board in Gaza. And each has particular expertise. Stephen Schlesinger was there at the what I think Trump probably regards as the prototype for his Board for Peace, the foundation of the UN, his momentous and memorable book, The Act of Creation, which dealt with just how enthusiastic the US was at the time in creating this body. And then we move to Craig, who's a long-time human rights lawyer and activist who spent 32 years in the belly of the beast in the UN, but came out of it with a not unalloyed view of it. I think we could say a realistic view rather than a cynical view. But what I'd like to discuss, we're looking at the Board for Peace, which was Trump managed to bamboozle the rest of the UN Security Council into supporting. I mean, it's not very often, we've all been involved in human rights here, it's not very often that the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation appear almost as knights in shining armor with halos. But on this occasion, in their vote, they did try to remind people there's this thing of international law, which sometimes applies. Doesn't apply to us, but it applies to everyone else. And it's rather disconcerting. It's now evolving. One of the memories which I'd like you to talk about was it's got an uncanny resemblance, and I presume the same State Department lawyers were involved in it, as when George W. Bush invented the coalition of the willing, which we can all remember. And this was the fact that he couldn't get international support for his invasion of Iraq. He invented the coalition of the willing and went round dragooning people. Countries were signed up because they didn't know they were signed up. I remember there's a confusion. Slovakia, as I remember, Slovakia had signed up and Slovenia hadn't. And the State Department, with their uncanny knowledge of geopolitics, got them mixed up. Plus others where countries, woke up in the morning and discovered they were part of the coalition that no one had told them about and worried about the backlash in their own countries. So this sounds almost as sort of half-cocked and ignorant as the Board for Peace. So is the board, the Board for Peace is not going to replace the UN, I don't think, but it's very worrying that it will be a further erosion of the UN, an act of decreation, you might say, erosion of its erosion of any popular support, which is already eroded by basically the spinelessness of many of the members on the Security Council. So, Steve, do you want to crack in on that aspect?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't take this very seriously. I think that this whole Board for Peace, is a vanity project, which allows Trump to reaffirm that he's sort of the Lord of the Manor, he's the king of the world, and it doesn't cost him anything because he doesn't have to. Unlike the UN, where we actually had legitimacy in international law, where every country in San Francisco, when they signed the treaty, had to take that treaty back to have it ratified by either their legislature or their parliaments. This has no basis in law at all. It's a self-created thing that Trump threw out there because he could use that as his way of dealing with Gaza, or at least putatively he's going to deal with Gaza. Although I must say his plans for Gaza are a little like the health plan coverage he has in this country. It's always getting ready. It's not ever quite there. And so we don't really know what's involved. But it is kind of impressive that he did get Russia and China to sign on to this thing. It was as if everybody wanted to get it out of their way and not have to deal with it. They throw it to this Trump thing, which it doesn't really. First of all, the claimants on seats have not been overwhelming. They've been mainly dictatorships or from illiberal democracies. You don't see many of the European countries signing on.
Even
And
Starmer is squirming, which is a sure sign that something's rotten in the state of Denmark.
it just it gives me the willies. It's another one of those Trump throw out. He throws things out, sees if it sticks to the wall, and if it doesn't, he discards it and goes on. We'll see, but I'll be interested to see what Craig has to say about it.
Well, if you could, Craig, address it. The Security Council voted to set this up. To what extent is that now, even though, is that a legitimate act of self-destruction by the Security Council? Have they handed all their prerogatives over to this vanity project of President Bush, of President Trump?
I think it is. I think I've called it an act of surrender for a number of reasons. I think Stephen is right that this began as a vanity project of Donald Trump. But what makes it much more dangerous in the end is the deference, first, the power of the US government and all of its lever on the one hand being lined up behind it. And secondly, the deference to that power by virtually the whole world. I mean, that resolution of the Security Council 2830 was unprecedented in the history of the United Nations. It was, I have argued, an unlawful and ultra vires act by the Security Council because it directly contradicts the highest norms of international law, so-called jus cogens and erga omnes rules of international law, that the Security Council does not have the authority to overrule. And it is an action that is outside the terms of the UN Charter, with terms of the Security Council and so on. And yet we saw 13 ambassadors vote in favor of it, and 2 P5 members, China and Russia, abstain and allow it to pass. That was a very dangerous signal. And that signal has even gotten more frightening subsequently when we see, Russia, one of those abstaining members, now, apparently joining the so-called Board of Peace, the Orwellian Board of Peace, which has nothing at all to do with peace. And when you see the monster that they've created, you realize that in its charter of this Board of Peace, it doesn't even mention Palestine or Gaza. It is meant to be a global initiative.
Exactly.
Which is entirely ruled in a very 19th century colonial, in fact, a King Leopoldian way by Donald Trump in his person, not in his standing as the president of the US.
We should remind the viewers that a Congress of European powers basically gave the Congo to King Leopold of Belgium.
As
he ran it as his
personal property. Yeah,
he ran it as his personal prototype of Gaza, where his people could make money out of it and exploit anyone as much as they like. Yeah. There are uncanny sort of echoes, aren't there?
Yeah. So it's very dangerous. Just to conclude that, on the one hand, this is, for me, it's the writing of the final chapter of the genocide in Palestine, because it's now being consolidated by a board that is headed by one of the perpetrators, meaning the US government, and includes the membership of the main perpetrator, which is to say Benjamin Netanyahu, on behalf of the Israeli regime. So very terrifying for the Palestinian people. Secondly, very dangerous for the region more broadly, in which a lot of complicit vassal states of Western Asia are also going to participate in this so-called board. And dangerous for the rest of the world, because the charter of the so-called Board of Peace is not limited to Gaza, but includes the potentially the entire world, all under the direct edicts of Donald Trump himself. So what this means for international law is frightening. More broadly, it has been under assault. It has lost a lot of legitimacy over the course of the past 2 years with the so-called first live-streamed genocide in history, and a failure of international law to respond effectively, and to the United Nations as an institution. And we can talk, in a more nuanced way about which parts of the UN, but the UN as an institution is broadly seen to have failed spectacularly in all of this. And now to hand it over with the actual cheering by the Secretary General of the United Nations, who welcomed this initiative and pledged the full support of the UN, to me, that is one of the final nails in the coffin of UN legitimacy.
Well, invertebrate, thy name is Guterres, I've seen over the last year or two. It's, but Steve, do you want to add to this?
I want to make another point too, which the way it's set up, as Craig was sort of alluding to, is the fact that the only person that has a veto on this board is Donald Trump. No other country does. He's the person who decides what issues are going to be discussed, what issues are going to not be discussed, who's going to be admitted, who isn't going to be admitted. And by the way, I may be wrong about this, but I do not think that Putin has agreed to be on the board yet. He frankly has more power being on the Security Council because he still maintains the veto than if he joins the Board of Peace where he doesn't have the veto. And my guess is that that notion that all power derives only from the chairman, Donald Trump, is going to scare away a lot of people a lot of states who just don't want to get entangled in the kind of Trump uh, Rubik cube, or whatever he's trying to do with it. Furthermore, there is, as we've discussed, there's not a single Palestinian representative on this board. It's some sort of technical board. I mean, it's going to evaluate Gaza, and there's nobody from Gaza basically on the board. We're supposed to take that seriously. And finally, there's a sense that Trump is, in my view, has thrown this out, I think, in many ways, because his failures have been substantial in foreign policy. He hasn't settled the Ukraine war. He hasn't, brought peace to various other areas that he claims to have brought peace to. It's a way of kind of saying, well, I still have time. I got this board. It's going to really work on all these different issues which haven't been settled yet. And furthermore, and I'm being a more domestically oriented this way, it's also a way for him to detract attention from his problems at home. I mean, the fact that we still have inflation, we still have grocery prices rising. We
still have
have
the Epstein files
the
unrevealed.
Epstein files. We have electricity going up. It's just another way of detracting from the real issues that face people in this country anyway.
Well, no, sometimes I think people overestimate Trump as having a deep geopolitical strategy. Now, John Bolton, who we've had for several times, actually puts it down to a sort of infantile desire for the Nobel Peace Prize. Barack Obama got one, so Trump thinks he needs one, and
I don't even
this
think
could be
it's
seen as a
infantile.
global polishing of his resume for his next entry for
I
the
mean,
prize.
he told the Prime Minister of Norway that's what he wants. And so it's not even infantile. It's a direct demand, and it shows you what bizarre personality this guy is. It's like kids in a high school, or a grammar school. I'm going to take my marbles home if you don't do what I want done. I mean, it's crazy.
It would be crazy if it weren't for, and I agree with that assessment 100%. But what's really terrifying is not the madness and the idiocy of Donald Trump, which seems to me is self-evident. It's the fact that the whole world is deferring to that madness and that idiocy that frightens me. I don't think it's impossible for Donald Trump to receive a Nobel Prize. The way these things work these days. I mean, he has been walking around making up, I mean, lying out of whole cloth this idea that he has resolved 8 conflicts. He has resolved no conflicts. What he has done, he has literally attacked more countries than any president in the history of the US. 3 during his first term, and just in the last year, 7 countries have been bombed by Donald Trump. If that is something that entitles you to, by the way, while also presiding over a genocide in Palestine, if that's something that entitles you to a Nobel Prize in a normal world, I'll be very surprised. In this world, I will not be surprised because the deference shown to him by, I mean, really the entire globe, by the Europeans, by his NATO allies, by people across Western Asia, even as the Israel-US project in Western Asia has left a trail of unprecedented bloodshed for the entire tenure of not just of Donald Trump's current term as president, but his predecessor as well. And yet the world is bowing down, and that includes, by the way, the political corridors of the United Nations, even as they see themselves being dismantled by these trends. So yeah, it is all absurd, but it's very, very real because the rest of the world hasn't had the courage or the principle to stand up to Donald Trump. And until that changes, I think this downward spiral is going to continue. A downward spiral for the U.S. in its own interest, a downward spiral for the rest of the world, a downward spiral for international law, and a downward spiral for the United Nations. They have to
Now,
get off their knees.
there may be one learning lesson in this all craziness, which is the whole Greenland issue. Because what Greenland, meant to me was that, you remember, we all understand that Trump is a bully. And the way you deal with bullies is you just stop them. You say, we're going to come back at you. And at least in the Greenland episode, most of the European countries basically said no, and they sent troops to Greenland. And they made clear that this was an issue, they were willing to fight over. And what happened? Trump looked for an exit because he knew that he couldn't get his way like a little kid.
Stephen, I think you might be hopelessly optimistic thinking they sent a token there, but whether they would fight or not is another
Well, that's
story.
another issue.
They
But
might
the
shoot
fact
a polar bear as a hostage, but I
it
don't think
was
they'll
it
whether they'd
was
actually draw weapons against invading Marines is another
it's
story.
a symbolically important
Exactly,
thing.
yes.
Yeah. And the fact is that what did Trump do? He eventually withdrew from the whole thing. He used that phony idea that we're going to redo the treaty that originally allowed the U.S. to put arms into Greenland. Well, of course, they haven't come up with any new terms. As far as I can see, it's the same old treaty that was, I think, established back in the 1940s or 50s,
51, I think it was.
51. And now, he's kind of glided on to something else. And this is his pattern. And that's why I think the Europeans, at least on this issue, finally woke up and said, for all our appeasing him, you got to at some point just say no. And it proved to be true, at least for the moment. He is not going into Greenland, as far as I know, and
For the moment.
and we don't know yet what other ways he's going to maneuver that issue beyond what he was trying to do just then.
There was
Yeah,
a suspicious power cut this weekend in New York, the Greenland capital. He probably claimed credit for it, whether or not, but it was suspiciously and auspiciously timed. Uh, and I wouldn't discount it completely without
I'm,
getting into
what was that again? What Greenland
in New
thing?
York, the capital. Apparently, this over the weekend, it had a long power cut,
Oh,
power
I didn't know
outage,
that. I didn't know
which
that.
a demonstration of capacity. Yeah, I think Stephen is right that what's been missing is the willingness to draw a line, and this obsequious desire to just continuously appease and coddle Donald Trump and his administration and what they are doing. And what Greenland has shown is a couple of things. One is good news, which is when you draw a line, it can have the kind of effect that you want it to have, and at least for the time being, he seems to have
it's a
backed off
slow
on.
sign or a halt sign.
Yeah, he
Don't
seems
know.
to, we'll see. He seems to have backed out, backed off for the time being. But what is disturbing about that line is it was a line drawn by NATO allies. It was not a line drawn by the world. Because what they have said is, okay, Donald Trump, and in fact, we see this in private emails that were leaked between European leaders like Macron and Donald Trump, where they say, look, everything else you want to do is fine, but don't touch Europe. And that's not the idea behind the UN Charter, as Stephen knows better than anybody. It's supposed to be this idea of a universal system based upon international law, the prohibition of aggression all the time. And yet Europe had no problem, or Canada or other previous allies of the US, with what the US did in Venezuela, with what the US did in Iran, with what the US did in Nigeria, Somalia. The line was only drawn when it came to Greenland, which is to say Europe. And the message that they have sent is, we are with you while you do this to the rest of the world, not while you do it to NATO allies or to somebody in the West. And while it's encouraging that a line was drawn, that frightens me for the future. And it should frighten anybody who wants to maintain an international system like that codified in the UN Charter.
Well, this is where the coalition of the willing parallel comes in. If he decided to attack Iran, then he will almost certainly invoke the Board of Peace for behind it. You know, he said there
Oh,
are no
I
resolutions against it, and the Board of Peace says yes, go ahead, and as it will do because he's stacked it.
no, I think you're absolutely right about that. I think that he, he doesn't want to have to deal with messy negotiations with the Security Council and even some vetoes. And this gives him a perfect out. He can go through this ridiculous thing that he set up. But this board has no basis in legal in international law. There haven't been any, treaty signed. This is something that he dreamt out of, one long night when he couldn't get to sleep and he hadn't attacked anybody recently in one of his long rants. And he thought, well, listen, this is a way of I'm cutting back on the UN, and I still can use the UN for a few things, like can use their platform to talk about America First policy. I could use the UN to slap a few sanctions on a few countries. I could use the UN to come up with these crazy ideas like my Gaza thing, or I can use the UN to outmaneuver China and Russia maybe from time to time. But with the Board of Peace, I can do anything. And there's nobody to mess with me. And so anyway,
But you remember the State Department's lawyers at the time of George W. Bush managed to knit from straw the cloth of gold to put some semblance of legality over their actions in Iraq, for example. They find a paragraph in a resolution somewhere that justified another paragraph, and it was a very thin, tenuous web that they wove, but they did weave it, and it was convincing enough because we have the other parallel I want to introduce is the Emperor's new clothes. If you remember, in the story, the Emperor was con men sold him a set of new clothes, spun of cloth of gold. They took the gold, and when he came out naked onto the platform, onto the balcony to be cheered by everybody, one little kid at the back said he'd got nothing on. And everyone dissolved into laughing. Now that my version of the story is they all turned around and beat up the little bastard for showing them up. And I think that's the situation we're in now. So it's really worrying. I mean, if he just starts to discuss, he's going to nominate his favorite racehorse, like Incitatus Caligula did as consul or senator, I forget which. Who's going to gainsay him? All of those worthy elderly fathers in Rome in the Senate sat around and probably discussed the merits of the horse and how fine its hooves were and what a good mane it had. They didn't say, "Are you mad?" And what we need now are people to say, "He's got no clothes on, and yes, you're mad."
But the people who that little guy in the back row who spoke out, that's the people of the world. Nobody in the world, amongst, reasonable people, believes that what Donald Trump is doing and what he is saying is anything that's worthy of respect. And I think a lot of people understand how dangerous it is. But state power is fully aligned behind him. As I said, the governments of the region, the governments of more globally than that, all of the institutions of state in the United States, and much to my disappointment, many voices within the United Nations that have gone along with this charade, up to and including the resolution that was adopted in the Security Council. And that doesn't seem to matter. The fact that the people of the world have recognized that the empire has no clothes doesn't seem to have impressed state power. And by the way, Ian, for your important role in the world as well, it doesn't seem to have impressed media corporations that themselves have been going along with this charade almost non-critically across, at least in the US, and I think to some degree in the
I
broad West.
dissociate myself from my colleagues in the media on this one. I think they're a cowardly bunch of spineless butterflies.
I was trying to be careful, but I agree with you.
No. No, some of our colleagues say I'm often too hard on people who, after all, constitute our members. And I think most of our members, I've spoken to them. I've known. I remember one who said, "You're all right, Ian. You can write nice things about the UN. My publishers wouldn't let me." And that was a few years ago. So it's got worse since then. So where do we go? Where is there a rollout for the UN both globally and in Gaza now? Because it's very difficult not to avoid being totally pessimistic and sticking your head in the sand and crying and telling sad stories of the death of kings.
Listen, I mean, the debate about the failures of the UN, whether it's going to survive, I mean, it's been around for 80 years, and that's not something to be laughed at.
Three score
And
years and 10.
that's right.
That's the
And
allotted
and
life.
and survived a lot of crises, whether it's the fact that we didn't do anything about Vietnam, the fact that we, stayed out of the invasion of Hungary. I mean, one crisis after another, it's sort of fizzle out of. And yet it survives. And the reason it survives is because there really, outside of the Board of Peace, is no other organization you can turn to when you do have these conflicts that have to be resolved. And the UN has resolved a lot of smaller conflicts. The Cuban Missile Crisis was partly resolved by, speaking of a big one, by the UN. But I do think that the Board of Peace throws a bit of a, I don't know, problem for the UN to deal with. But in the end, you're not going to get 193 countries joining the Board of Peace. You just, well, I think they're 20 now, and most of them are either dictatorships or illiberal democracies. Why should they join an organization that only one person has the veto and basically dominates the whole body? And furthermore, they've been using the UN for 80 years. They're not about to transfer all the different issues that they deal with at the UN to this board. I just don't see. Yeah, first of all, let's see what he does with Gaza, because I don't think it's going to be a very effective body in Gaza. But I think Craig's right that there's a lot of state power behind it, and I think that is very concerning. But I don't see where they're coming up with solutions to Gaza. I think it became a way of an exit for a lot of countries that just don't want to deal with the issue. Throw it in Trump's hand, let him handle it, let him get the blame, and we'll go on, and we'll see what happens.
Craig, do you want to come in there? Because I think that it will be effective in Gaza in a very negative way. I mean, this is a cabal of crooks and real estate financiers taking over a strip on which was, what, 70,000 corpses, 70 million tons of rubble, and
Yeah.
but great opportunity for a Mediterranean seafront property.
Yeah. Unquestionably, Stephen's right that it's not going to be effective in securing peace and human rights and sustainable development and reconstruction. None of that is going to be a product of this colonial enterprise, which is, by the way, largely just an extension of the same oppression that the people in Gaza have been subjected to, the Palestinian people have been subjected to for a very long time now. So no, it can't achieve that, but it can achieve the kinds of ends that its very nefarious architects want it to achieve. People like Donald Trump and Jared Kushner and Tony Blair and others, which is basically a successful colonization for their own financial gain of what's left of the survivors of a genocide and of a genocided land, and that's terrifying. And the fact that any of this is being normalized is especially terrifying. And it's one thing not to join the Board of Peace, which I think, it will be to the eternal shame of any country that does join this enterprise. It's another thing to refuse to cooperate with the Board of Peace. And I see too many cowardly governments and UN officials and others who, while perfectly understanding the danger of this enterprise, nevertheless will use language of cooperation and we'll see how we can cooperate with it. And even less those that are willing to challenge the Board of Peace, which I think anyone who wants to see the survival of international law, of international institutions like the UN, they need to directly challenge it. And there are powers within the UN even to challenge this, if there is a willingness to do so in this age of empire, I have to say. Some parts of the UN have behaved very well during this frightful period. The independent human rights mechanisms of the UN have been absolutely courageous. The International Court of Justice has been absolutely principled and courageous. The UN General Assembly has shown moments of light where it was willing to exercise the powers that it has, including, for example, under the Uniting for Peace mechanism and so on, that allow it to get around Security Council vetoes and so on. What's left so far that I think we need, if we're going to find real hope, is some willingness on the part of the global majority of member states in the United Nations to actually join together in an act of collective power to defend international law, to defend the UN, to defend the human rights of the Palestinian people. And by the way, since this is not just a Palestinian board, but a board that has now a global remit to defend peace and human rights in the rest of the globe. If we don't see them joining together to do so, and remember, the global South is not what it used to be. It's very fragmented. A lot of countries of the South have been bought off by the Americans, by the Israelis, and by others. We don't have that sort of unity of purpose that we saw for a moment in the 1960s and 70s by the global South. But until we get something like that, and I think that's going to either come from the people of all of these countries, or it's not going to come at all because the power centers have decided this is in their interest. But those people who want to make sure that their governments individually and collectively are doing the right thing are going to have to get mobilized to demand that we end this charade and move back toward a gradual process of building a world governed by the rule of law.
Well, that's extremely optimistic of you. I
Is it?
can't help being cynical about this because if the board of, I mean, one of my current worries is I'm looking around for signs. And we saw, I think it was, there've been a few floaters in some articles in Arab magazines were suggesting that Western Sahara is empty. What a nice place for the people to Gaza to move into. It's sand, so they'll feel at home. And the government of Morocco is Arab. So okay, they're Arab tyrants and bloodthirsty thugs, but they're Arab bloodthirsty tyrants. So the Palestinians should be happy. And now we have the recent issue of Somaliland, which is a whole sort of different kettle of fish. Because I actually think Somaliland has a reasonable case for a negotiated independence based upon its tenure. But they've
You you
forfeited their
left it.
legitimacy with accepting with going in for the Israeli recognition and discussing, by all accounts, a home for Palestinians.
You left out the Polisario in the Moroccan equation. You're not dealing with just them, with the
Oh,
Moroccan.
I didn't leave them out. I haven't left them out in my mind. I forgot
Oh,
to mention them because we got so many
yeah.
different factors in already.
But the other part of this is, which is very depressing to me, and this is a purely issue to do with American life, is that the lack of concern among Americans about how we are cutting so much out of the UN budget to the point where we're really shrinking the organization. And there's been no outcry about this. Even my own Democratic Party has not made this an issue the way I think it should have. And the international budget of the U.S. government as of the May 1st submission was cut back by 83%. I mean, that's extraordinary, that the amount of money that's being taken out of that budget. And of course, the UN suffers the worst without our, basis of that big contributor of 22%. We wouldn't have that kind of power, but we're using that power in the most egregious way to make the UN smaller and less visible and less of a force in the world. And nobody in this country has really made an outcry over this. And so putting the Board of Peace to one side, the other side is how we're crippling this organization, one that we created, that we supported, that we pushed for, that we have paid the budget for almost 80 years. We're basically, reducing it to a body which is not the same anymore, and probably won't be the same in the years to come.
Well, we have with the Board of Peace and other issues. One of the things coming up this year is, of course, is the elections for Secretary General. So, what are the chances of getting a Secretary General, male or female, with a spine in the face of vetoes? I invite your prognostications on this.
I think it's highly unlikely. Anything can happen in this universe, but I think the UN is on its knees. And I think from that position, it's going to be very hard to push to have a Secretary General who is, I mean, as you know, every time these elections come up, you hear from the US that they want a secretary general that's more secretary and less general, less Dag Hammarskjöld and more Ban Ki-moon. And I think that the risk now is that they are so battered and beaten, and here I'm talking about within the secretariat and the agencies, that they will sell the shop, whatever's left of the shop, just to have a nod from the emperor that they will provide some resources and not take the next step in destroying the organization. So I think it's very dangerous for, the future of a UN that's based upon the principles of the organization, the norms and standards of the organization. The whole shop could be sold out in the next phase. So I'm not at all enthusiastic about what could come. Now, the other possibility is you might get and of course, as you know, the way secretaries general are nominated is not a democratic process of all member states and so on, right? The veto comes into play and all of these other sort of things. So you're never going to get some, hero, heading the organization. But to get a reasonably good secretary general would take a real mobilization, I think, on the part of the rest of the world, who I will say again, their vote has not been heard. And if people can see that there are good things and bad things about the U.S. I mean, slashing and burning agency contributions and so on is a very bad thing. And by the way, as they set up their alternative organization in which they want $1 billion from each member who will have a permanent seat on the Board of Peace, they can't meet their own dues in the United Nations. But the U.S. doesn't play only a positive role in the UN. The U.S., the part of the UN that I worked in for all those years was the human rights side of the house, where I watched the US play a very negative role on 75% of the human rights agenda. They opposed economic and social rights. They opposed the program on capital punishment. They opposed the anti-racism agenda. They opposed the indigenous rights agenda. They opposed the right to development. They opposed, a large chunk of the human rights program was actually actively opposed by a very powerful member state in the United States. The absence of the US from some human rights mechanisms actually gives them the freedom to move forward in a more progressive way around human rights issues. But in the end, it does come down to money in large measure. So unless other member states see this as an opportunity and begin to fill the gaps left by US abdication, by increasing their contributions and their engagement in the UN more broadly. And, there are lots of problems with the UN. The other is that we keep talking about member states, and member states are not the world. Member states are just the empowered actors in intergovernmental institutions. But at least there would be an opportunity to preserve some of the principles of the organization and not just have it become, frankly, another extension of empire, in which case I don't see the value of the UN just as an extension of imperial power.
Steve?
Now, excuse me, the other side to this whole financing issue is the other biggest contributor to the UN is China, which is now what, 20%. So as the U.S. reduces its contributions, China becomes far more powerful in the United Nations and will take advantage of it. Why shouldn't they? I mean, if you're a big contributor, you can get away with a lot more. And this is, all this business of in Washington of outcry about our biggest competitors, China. We've got to fight them on Taiwan. We've got to fight them on the economic trade. We have to, have more armaments than they do. And yet they're not even dealing with the issue, which is going to happen in the UN, where they're going to basically lose control of the organization because they're cutting back so significantly on the dues and their voluntary contributions and so on, peacekeeping. It's the contradictions in this Trump administration are so absurd and so ridiculous and so weakening to the overall quality of our foreign policy. It is frightening, and so this poor organization is now going to get hit by probably the onslaught of the Chinese. And if you think human rights are pretty bad under the U.S., they're going to be really bad under China. So we'll see what happens.
Well, I remember in my years when I was president of the Correspondence Association at the UN, the deference to China was fairly constant. People like Kofi Annan of saintly memory would still defer to the Chinese on issues that he knew were wrong. And he's explained to me a couple of times that, look, I've got to do it because, and that was before they were major contributors. So it's getting, as you say, it's getting a bit ominous. And the key issue here at the moment is the fact that the US has put sanctions on all of those independent human rights mechanisms that Craig was discussing, that judges, Francesca Albanese, the other people, judges have got sanctions against them. And governments are doing nothing.
Precisely. That's the thing. It's not the madness of the emperor. It's the fact that the rest of the world have done nothing to come to the defense of the ICC judges, the ICC prosecutor, the UN Special Rapporteur, and others who are subjected to these sanctions, and they have the power to help to shield people who are suffering personally greatly, they and their families, from the abuse of sanctions by Donald Trump and
I've
his.
had a call in for, I think it's 6 weeks to the UN and the spokesman's office to ask what their plan is for assisting these sanctioned and beleaguered individuals. I still haven't heard anything.
They've done virtually nothing in the UN itself to protect and defend their personnel from these sanctions. And so, it's where we started. Everybody is on their knees, and this cannot end well unless people start to stand up, join together, collectively, as was envisioned by the charter itself, to try to push back. I mean, this cannot be the case that. It's one thing for the U.S. to withdraw from all these international organizations, which is a detriment to themselves. I mean, how do you, in an age of global viruses, withdraw from the World Health Organization of the United Nations? It doesn't make any logical sense, if you're concerned about the well-being of people, which clearly they are not. But to actually then actively attack people for doing their jobs, for defending human rights, for advancing international law. That's a very scary abuse of power that we have not seen, that these international institutions have not had to endure in the past. That's a new chapter.
And it's almost unpublicized. Where's the
Yeah,
indignation?
yeah.
Where's the press and the prime ministers and presidents elsewhere saying, "Up with this, we will not put."
Well,
Unless it's Greenland.
the press regards the Trump administration as all powerful, and therefore, if they're going to put these sanctions on the various judges, okay, that's Trump doing his thing, and they're not focused on the fact that this is all against the values of our country, of our Constitution, our democracy, what we've fought for 250 years. None of this stuff seems to be in play. It's all, well, Trump does his thing and we have to accept it. And every once in a while we'll stick it to him. Maybe, maybe Minnesota is going to be a turning point as far as domestic politics go.
Or
Towards the
maybe
whole
it's going to be an excuse to trigger the Insurrection Act.
Well, that's another thing too. So you never know with this guy. But the point is that we've lost all the values that count as a result of this mayhem, and it's very sad. It really is very sad.
Well, I wish we could end on a more optimistic note, but we want to be realist about this. I tend to agree with both of you on your gloomy prognoses. I wish I could see light at the end of the tunnel, but it might just be New Jersey in flames. So we'd we should call a halt in this. Thank you very much, both of you. I think it's been an interesting kicking the ball around, and we should go and get ready to greet Incitatus, the Emperor's racehorse, as the next senator or vice president. Mind you, yes, he has a horse as vice president already.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Craig.
Real pleasure to be in conversation with both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well,
Nice
speak to
meeting
you
you,
again
Craig.
soon, I hope. Bye.
Okay.